Behind every act of heroism is a failure of the government to perform its duty to provide welfare and ensure the safety of its citizens. On side proposition, we do not stand for the abject glorification of militaries that go out and slaughter millions in conflict, nor do we stand for the lauding of nurses passing out after a 96-hour shift because they were brave to do so. Three arguments then. First, I will briefly touch upon why our primary obligation is to ourselves and how heroism infringes upon it. Second, I will explain how this narrative is being used adversely by governments. And then lastly, I will deal with how heroism is actively harmful to social justice advocacy. The setup in this debate is quite simple. We think it's broadly threefold. The first is that heroism is ingrained within our culture, right? From a very young age, you learn about this in school through things such as value education or having awards. Second, media propagates heroism in various forms. For example, glorifying soldiers through movies and cartoons, awarding knighthood and other national recognitions for acts of bravery, etc. The next thing here is while the range of good acts is obviously varied, the nature of what is considered heroic often involves obvious actions of self sacrifice, putting yourselves in danger either for the benefit of someone else or for the greater good, things like that. So, things that are very visual, very visceral, things that are likely to incite emotion amongst individuals. The last thing I want to note here is that the threshold for what is considered heroic is stretches every day and pushes extreme actions, which means one day it's beating up a thief, and then to one up that action, the next would be stopping a kidnapper by jumping in front of a car. Moving on to argumentation then. The first on setting unrealistic expectations on individuals and why this is harmful. This argument is specifically targeted towards individual acts of goodness or helping individuals, like helping people next to you out. I think heroism generally places an expectation on individuals to constantly help each other out. Otherwise, you're not considered a model citizen. This means messaging such as whenever you see danger on the streets, you must help out the other person. Or even in certain extreme cases, enforcing Good Samaritan laws that penalize individuals for not helping the other person out. Effectively, what this means is that at every point in time, you are seeking out danger, or when you see a dangerous situation next to you, you consider it your obligation to go out and help. Why do we think this is harmful? On two fronts. First, we think that you primarily owe an obligation to yourself, that is, for your general well being and to ensure that you are out of danger. The reason for this is quite simple. Only you are in control of your life. That's a constant. You can decide what harms you and what doesn't. I do think that acts of heroism, unfortunately, aren't taken with much foresight. That is, you see a situation, you immediately put yourself in it, which means you don't have time to weigh the pros and cons of whether or not you're likely to be safe after this encounter, which makes it a lot more dangerous given that you didn't actually take time to think this decision through. Second argument then on on the adverse usage of the heroic narrative. I think there are broadly three parts to this. The first is the idea on essential sector workers. The second is just on why governments use this narrative to spread bad political incentives. The first then is on essential sector workers. We think the range of what heroism is considered has shifted and varies based on sector to sector. And the messaging, given that it is controlled by the media and in large parts the government, is quite convenient for the government to shirk off its obligations. For example, during COVID, this looked like the narrative of abject heroism. That is, nurses and doctors sacrifice their lives for the people, for the citizens. Doing something bigger than themselves means that they tend to get overworked. The similar is true for firefighters and just generally people within similar sectors. I think the impact of this is quite clear. The point at which you keep pushing that nurses and doctors are heroic, that they're doing something bigger than themselves, that they put humanity first, and that they're sacrificing themselves. And when sacrifice is viewed as a good thing, it effectively means you are overlooking issues within that system. So this means you have lower wages and poorer labor structures for these individuals. They're not allowed to go on strikes, for example. Generally, the system is quite bad. We think this shifts the point at which not these actions are not viewed as heroic, and in fact, a job or people putting lots of effort in um, to get the work done. Second portion to governments shirking their obligations. I think this is specifically towards the military and police systems. It is impossible to view people as multidimensional humans because of the emphasis placed on heroism. That is, it is so tilted towards heroic acts that it allows unchecked violence, free from criticism, to go away because of the emphasis on the good act. That means you're always going to highlight what the action was. And because this individual has done a good thing, they possibly could not be bad. This broadly applies to systems as well, both in the military and in the police, because they are seen as doing something good or performing actions that are good, and therefore are like just immune to criticism and immune to any kind of review. The last thing here on government obligation is that I think it leads to a rise in vigilantism, that it allows governments to shirk their burden of helping society because they know the next individual is just going to rise up to the occasion and put themselves in harm's way to save individuals. I think generally this leads to less safety and more risk, but it still allows governments to not, for example, have oversight in those areas. Quickly, then, on the last argument on harming social movements, I think the thesis of the argument is similar. That is, when you have large acts of heroism, for example, in some instances, martyrdom, it is incredibly distracting from the agenda of the movement and takes away from any traction that otherwise would have been given to real issues. Yeah.
The act of heroism, which is defined as selfless and brave acts, especially in the face of danger, often are necessary to combat a lot of the evils in this world that exist independent of the debate and often happen for reasons beyond our control. We would characterize this as number one, brave acts of selflessness. This looks like saving people from a fire, even at the expense of your own safety. This looks like, for example, simple things like helping out struggling individuals in public spaces, like in parks, in the grocery, in public transport, for example. Or number three, standing up against unfair structures and unfair narratives, like racial bias or gender bias, for example, in the workplace, in the state, and in the broader community. What opposition is going to come to you and tell you is that heroism, and let alone welcoming its prominence, results in people taking irrational actions in order to exhibit heroism and kindness, often to the detriment of their own selves. And they will explain to you that individuals have responsibility not to their family, not to broader society, but instead to themselves at the end of the day. We would suggest that while that may be true, the reason why we all exist in this society, and often in the absence of the state, the only people that we can rely upon is each other, and therefore welcoming this prominence allows for one, not just better social outcomes, but also long-term effects for progress. The first thing I'm going to explain is that historically, there has been a prevalence of individualism, which results in uncountered selfishness for individual people. Number one, this is often driven by a highly capitalist society where people are forced to compete whether for limited slots in universities admissions or in promotions within their own workplaces or anything that would result in their own personal or economic gain. Number two, people, when acting in their own self-interest within these contexts, tend to either A, serve as bystanders by a decreased willingness to help others who are struggling in school or in the workplace or in the broader community for fear that it would compromise their own interest and their own economic gain, or B, actively sabotage others, which creates a worse moral outcome, often throwing them under the bus in front of their peers, in front of their teachers, in front of their bosses, or, for example, making it very difficult to share notes or share information that would allow them to succeed and thrive together as a team and as a whole society. Number three, there is strong social pressure to accept this individualism and selfishness. This looks like when we are silent when people get harassed in public transport, or when we ignore single single parents who are struggling at the grocery store with their bags while also juggling handling their kids. Either because it's normal to subscribe to this level of individualism, we're expected to look away and not care about what happens to other people, let alone strangers, or we fear being ostracized or criticized if we help out people for fear that we are seen as too nosy or too involved in the lives of other individuals beyond our own. But number four, even if individuals are not malicious actors, many institutions and factors beyond their control put people in unfortunate situations that they themselves cannot get out of. This looks like a natural man or like non-man-made disasters that displace people from their homes, like typhoons, like earthquakes, where it becomes very difficult for one individual person or even one individual family to be able to uplift themselves from that difficult outcome. Or number letter B, rather, unfair state processes like police brutality and the unfair deportation of immigrants who came to their migrating countries legally. Or letter C, biases like racism, homophobia, ableism, propagated by people who on either side of the debate would be unwaveringly difficult and would likely continue to espouse their bias and hatred towards the specific people that they're targeting. Therefore, the prominence of heroism is good because it pushes back against these trends and against these evils in this world. And this is analyzed through 5 levels. The first is it creates a positive association to selflessness, which extends to social rewards because people now are more welcoming of the practice of becoming selfless, of the practice of doing good for others, the practice of being brave, even when it is difficult or socially unrewarding to do so, or it doesn't result in your personal or economic gain. That means people are more incentivized to do it, even in the instances where it doesn't favor them, which increases the scenarios and chances by which people will do more pro-social behavior. Or number two, it gives people a safe space to be more selfless. They will no longer feel like they're ostracized or criticized in the workplace or in the broader community for being altruistic and supporting other people. And as a result of that, they are more incentivized to participate in this pro-social behavior. 3, it recognizes those who exert more heroism, which is critical in encouraging people to do the right thing, especially when it is difficult. It is like supporting people when their house is burning down, standing up for marginalized peoples in conservative communities. It is in these contexts and in these areas where heroism is all the more needed because the legal structures, the like police or state structures, for example, maybe their own individual economic circumstances bar them from being able to liberate themselves or make their quality of life or quality of living easier. Number 4, while there are some social changes that will take time to come into fruition, i.e., Stonewall riots and lobbying of marriage equality, or women's suffrage and the extended maternity and advocating for things like extended maternity leave in the workplace, heroism is what allows movements to take the incremental steps needed for long-term reform and change. On opposition, the lack of prominence of heroism means reluctance from people that want to instigate this change via, for example, participating in protests or challenging the opinions of states and police forces, for example, and a lack of social support when the limited people who choose to overcome that reluctance choose to actually take action. Finally, independent of being able to achieve the fullest extent of social outcomes, like law changes or social acceptance for marginalized and maligned peoples, the act of heroism and its prominence is important because as we coexist in a society and in the absence of being able to rely on the state, the closest alternative to those who will protect you, support you, and help you are people in your community. And that's why it needs to be prevalent. It needs to be prominent because that social safety net does not work if only a minimum or a small amount or select few of people participate in that act of heroism, feel like they have a moral responsibility to protect not just themselves and their interests, but the broader community as well.